The first one is, question is telling who actually is the one who is repeating the meme that the 20th century was the most violent in history, and I agree with you. It tends not to be historians, and I certainly wouldn't want to defy the consensus of historians who know these facts orders of magnitude better than I do. But I think the answer to the question, why is it such a popular belief, comes from your fourth point, namely the widespread discomfort that European high culture had with modernity. And usually when people say the 20th century was the most violent in history, they're making some kind of moralistic point, that for all our apparent progress, sophistication, and so on, the 20th century allegedly being the most violent just shows how misleading that is, and how we really have not made progress despite the superficial signs of it. Which is one of the reasons I think it's important to be reminded of the fact that by objective measures, modernity really has given us gifts, and its promise has in fact not been an illusion. Because it reflects back on many of the drivers of modernity that I would argue we ought to cherish, such as the concept of human rights. Whether the progressive secular consensus that religion was in decline has been falsified is not, it's not obvious that it has globally, that we certainly have seen a resurgence of religious fundamentalism in many parts of the Islamic world, in many of the American red states, in sub-Saharan Africa. But on the other hand, the repeated public opinion polls from the Pew Charitable Trusts and others do show currents going in the opposite direction, especially when you break it down by age cohort. Younger people they tend not to say that they are atheist, but which is still a kind of boo word, a kind of, it's like confessing to a murder to say that you're an atheist. There's definitely a branding problem with the term atheism, which is, I think, why so many euphemisms have popped up, like freethinker, secularist, humanist, agnostic, and so on. But the number of people who are who say they're affiliated with a religious movement has been in sharp decline, especially in the younger cohorts. The number of people who say that they are spiritual but not religious, again, I think another euphemism for a decline in traditional theistic beliefs, have also increased. By some estimates, it's now 15% of the American population, which is way up from what it was even 20 years ago. And worldwide, there are other huge parts of the world, swaths of the world, that are also not religious, in particular China. That's 1.3 billion people, where even though there are some currents for the return of religious belief. But this is, to a first approximation, 1.3 billion atheists. It's kind of the legacy in part of Mao. You can't celebrate this development altogether, but large parts of Asia are no longer religious. And it is certainly true that part of the bargain of modernity, which includes, I think, lower rates of violence, comes from a greater individualism, consumerism, a loss of, I wouldn't say a loss of certain cultural traditions, because they're still around for anyone who wants to partake in them. And I think if you look at a modern society, there is an enormous diversity of lifestyle choices, everything from hippie communes to Christian fundamentalist communities, to all kinds of nooks and crannies of urban lifestyles. It's not clear to me that the diversity of subcultures, ways of life, belief systems has actually decreased, and I suspect that if it could be measured, it would be shown to increase. That having been said, I think we have to be wary of the usual intellectuals' disdain for consumerism, and I think Adam Smith's quote that you don't murder your customers is telling, that in general, when societies become more consumerist, they're less likely to want to throw away a rather pleasant lifestyle to advance the glory of their state, ethnic group, or empire, and I think this is a very, very good thing. When you go back 100 years ago to the romantic militarism that was common, particularly among artistic and intellectual elites, the idea that war, rather than our current conception as a undesirable but sometimes necessary means to an end, more than 100 years ago, war was considered to be intrinsically valuable. It was heroic, it was manly, it was spiritual, it called forth the highest qualities of human character like self-sacrifice, courage, and it was seen as a worthy bulwark against the advancement of deplorable trends like effeminacy and consumerism and hedonism. And we know where that led. There was a headlong rush into war 100 years ago, partly fueled by the widespread belief that war was intrinsically desirable. So when you think that consumerism, hedonism, selfishness were considered the bad things for which militarism and war were the cure, it gives you an appreciation that people enjoying simple pleasures or sometimes complicated pleasures in life is not necessarily something that we should sneer at as much as we tend to do. The idea that we have substituted physical violence for some kind of psychological violence, I think is quite obscure. Solitary confinement is a form of physical violence. A man with a gun forces you into a highly stressful, aversive place that you don't want to go. I just call that violence. It is violence. There's a guy with a gun who forces you to go. I don't think they're calling it psychological violence, other than the obvious fact that it is psychologically extremely a form of torture to be confined on one's own is really necessary. Nor do I think that there's any particular reason to believe that forms of coercion have been any greater since the elimination of horrific corporal punishment than they were beforehand. So I think despite its popularity, I have never found the Foucault analysis particularly compelling. I don't think that historically he has documented what many people take for granted. And there were institutions, schools, convents, governments, and so on, which were plenty coercive before the elimination of cruel punishments. So in general, one conclusion that just repeatedly strikes me in reviewing the history of violence is that there is no law of conservation of violence. It's not that you squeeze one end of the balloon and it bulges out somewhere else. You really can have societies where every form of violence can get reduced. And conversely, there are societies in which every form of violence is not just implemented, but often valorized. So the societies that beat their children are also the societies that tend to get into wars, where you have cultures of honor in which men respond with violence to insults. These are the cultures in which you have strapping and paddling in schools. Conversely, in societies like, say, Scandinavia, every form of violence seems to have been reduced at once. They stay out of wars, they have low rates of homicide, they don't spank their children, and they're all in all pretty pleasant places to live. And finally, I do agree that the fragility of societies, the way in which a society can seemingly be taken over by horrific practices that proliferate and are perpetrated by quite ordinary people, is one of the great intellectual challenges at the boundary between social psychology, history, sociology, and probably some of the new disciplines like the study of social networks and social influence that are only beginning to flourish. I cite in the book some studies by both laboratory and computer simulation by Michael Macy at Cornell, which I consider to be the first of set of studies that I hope to see more of that answer the question of how you can get unpredictable tipping points in a society from civility to barbarism. Macy argues that a critical component is the violent intimidation of dissent by a well-armed minority, which can give rise to a kind of pluralistic ignorance where no one privately need believe that what they're doing is justified, but everyone believes that everyone else believes that it's justified. Moreover, everyone is willing to punish those that deviate from the practice, not because they think the punishment is deserved, but because they in turn feel that they will be punished if they don't take part in it. And so, according to this analysis, which I think has some history behind it, in the development of Nazi Germany, there were years of intimidation in which people who spoke out against the Nazis were systematically murdered and intimidated. There may be reason to believe, likewise, similar things happened with the rise of fascism, Bolshevism, and Japanese ultranationalism, that when you have suppression of speech and association and a well-armed group of fanatical thugs, then that can create a tipping point where the entire society is a combination of browbeaten, converted, or goes along to get along to implement quite horrific policies. So this is going to be a complicated and fascinating and important story of social dynamics, one that I agree that we don't yet understand, but which I would consider to be a high priority for the understanding of social change.